Recently, I've been wanting to create my own tiny universe within my crafts. Kinda like Boy Like Hobby Time's Wild Imaginary West, but with less personality since I'm a sucker for medieval fantasy, so I decided to start with an idea I've had for long, a sort of lava golem. As all golems, it needs an aluminum skeleton, and until you can prove me the contrary, I'm not wrong. It then gets covered in clay before I can start adding details by smooshing lumps of clay here for his moves. After I put some gloves on so as to prevent fingerprints, I can start detailing this otherwise rather tasteless body. I can then start adding his pack, a pack of 6. I use a variety of different tools so as to get a smooth surface I can roughen later on. And that's what I have at the end. I then poke some holes in Jeff's back so as to endow him with volcanoes or craters. I wrinkled it a bit so as to give it more shape. Now for the arms, I started with a finger snap giving me 2 bland looking clay arms I unmuscled by adding and blending different sized lumps of clay. I'm trying to be somewhat accurate in my muscle placement, except for those craters on the shoulders. After all has been smoothed, I can replicate the muscle details on the other arm. And obviously I had to do the north of the borders special. After that, it's time for the legs, as you can't see. That gets some, once more, somewhat accurate muscle placement, though when sculpting a lava golem, realism is not the priority. After I finished unmuscling his legs and his cheeks, of course, I can finally start adding previously mentioned details by carving some lines in Jeff's pectoral with a ball stylus so as to mimic rocks. I then followed the same principle on his pack. And then kind of all over his body. And obviously I didn't forget his cheeks, which get rocked up. Now, in order to prevent harsh edges, I go over all Jeff's body with acetone. It melts the clay a tiny bit, enough for said harsh edges to be smoothed. Then, with the help of a texture roller, I applied a rocky texture on an otherwise blunt surface. And after a quick bake, that's what I have. And now, I can add the previously mentioned craters on his back and his shoulders. And now for his hands, I just take some blobs of clay and I cut an appropriate number of fingers before adding a thumb. The hands get the same texturing as the rest of the body. I can now work on the other hand, which I chose to close but forgot to put a weapon into in the end. For his head, I went through a whole lot of troubles since heads are the bane of my existence. For now, he sorta looks silly, but with this addition, he looks silly and angry. I can then work on his screaming mouth, which get textured using a ball stylus. After I put some spare pre-baked eyes in place, I can blend them in using more lumps of clay. And after a lot of back and forth, I'm left with that. The hands and the head then gets a coat of acetone for the same reasons as previously mentioned. The only downside is that acetone dries the clay and can cause cracks in some places on thinner models. And that's Jeff completed, so now he needs color. Since he is most certainly not a red door, he doesn't get a coat of black. Instead, I covered him in a layer of white primer with a little help from my airbrush. I then was crazy enough to think I would be able to paint it with a brush, but after 10 minutes on an arm, I decided to go with the airbrush once more. I went through around 10 to 12 layers from red to slightly more orange red to slightly even more orange red to slightly even more oranger red, and the same with yellows after. And I've not filmed every layer since it's really the same thing over and over again 10 to 12 times, but it was worth it since I love the result. However, since Jeff's now kinda red but still not a door, I can partially paint him black, hoping his stones won't roll. I went with a black overbrush. Of course his cheeks get the same treatment. And for the other type of rocks, I went with a lighter black, or a dark grey if you wish, and much more sparingly since I love the gradient so much I wanted to keep it as visible as possible. And now with Jeff done, it's time to make a victim. This small stick man gets a layer of clay until it looks like a boot on which I can add an armor plate and secure it in place with a belt. I won't have much footage to show here since I'm really bad at holding my sculpture in front of the camera. I can then work on a pair of trousers, adding at least one wrinkle for obvious reasons. I can once more add an armor plate secured by leather belts. For the other side though, I wanted to change things a bit, so I gave Carl a small pouch attached on belts. For the torso, I slapped on a lump of clay and smoothed it before adding an ever important collar so as to protect Cole's neck from the sun. After it's all been smoothed, I can add a bit more fabric on the coat, and when once again it's all smoothed, I can press on some buttons. The left arm then gets an armor plate, and I can put a leather strap around his body for his body to have a leather strap. For the head, I just did what I could considering the small size, as you still can't see, and it looks awful, but this fifth attempt is by far the less awful one. Not the best one, the less awful. Now for the paint, the metallic parts get a metallic paint coat, so silver on the armor and buckles, and a bronze color for the buttons of the coat and the pouches. The leathery parts get painted with an appropriate leathery brown. And the coat gets a couple layers of bright vermilion orange toned down by the grey of the clay beneath. The boots get a leather brown color, but much darker than the belts so as not to blend them together. Then the pants get a coat of grey and the hair a coat of brown. And that's Carl done, so now it's time for a base. I just slapped my special goop on some foam offcuts I glued together using copious amounts of hot glue. The goop is just some plaster mixed with water, Mod Podge, sand and pebbles from my garden. After brushing the excess off, I can apply a coat of black Mod Podge, which is just black acrylic paint and Mod Podge mixed in a random ratio. Now for some color, I just applied a dark grey or light black if you wish on the surface using a beauty blender so as to retain shadow in the recesses. And after a series of progressively lighter greys dry brushed over the surface, the base is done, meaning it's resin time. I'm using a 2:1 ratio epoxy resin, and after measuring it carefully, I can pour it in several times so as to create variation with the different colors, which will end up being useless because it all blended together. I then created some swirls in the resin, but no one will ever see it. And with that, I think we're all set to admire this small craft. I had some trouble during the demolding of the resin since the small sheets were not acrylic but polycarbonate, which sticks to the resin very well. So I ended up covering my mistakes because according to Diana from Crossing Craft, mistakes you can't see don't count. Now for what I like and what I could improve. My sculpting work still feels a bit wonky and lifeless and could use some practice, especially for the faces and the hands, and also all that small. However, I really like the terrain, it's quite what I was going for, and the paintwork on Jeff is quite nice. I love the gradient I made, it's my favorite craft yet. The vision I have is that Carl is part of the Order of the Golden Leaf, which is a well-known guild in the lands of Attirium. They explore dungeons and dangerous places for people not to get hurt. Unfortunately, Carl lost his group during an expedition in the mines of God's Ore and encountered Jeff, an ancient lava golem, and against his anointed fire magic, Carl stood no chance. Tell me what you think. And with that, I think that's it for this video and hope to see you on the next time. Bye!